Nice to meet you indirectly, at least. It's always a bit strange to be talking to the screen, but I will not make this very longer. I was just wanted to go a little bit deeper into what is the topic we have, because the next pandemic is obviously something we are, at least on the European side, we are still living through it. Things are going quite fast and changing, and hopefully it will improve. But what I kind of wanted to a little bit touch on this evening is that every time there is a black swan event, a little bit like the COVID has been, we always have a flurry of analysts and opinion leaders telling us that this, there's going to be a huge change and everything is going to be different from now. History seems to say, no, it actually is not like that. It is actually not a lot of things change. So this pandemic has been very asymmetric. It is touching countries in different orders. It's touching on different arguments, but and also during the whole year, it have evolved quite a lot of discussion. But there have been some themes that have been kind of going on quite constantly. And in the beginning, it was a lot of discussion about science and fact-driven decision making. Obviously also linked to the whole thing in the US regarding presidential election and so on. And then we had all the discussion about sustainability. We had, videos of the dolphins in Venice. We had the view of the Himalayas, which people hadn't seen from Punjab for ages. So we had a lot of this discussion. Then we had the whole digital economy growing very fast and all the impact of that. And we had the discussion about the overall well-being, the mental well-being. We had the discussion about, let's say, social cohesion. So all things that are very important and issues that actually had been in the discussion, but somehow became more important. And the question I have really asked myself this year, I mean, will we learn anything from it? Will history be different this time than before? Are we as a humans, are we capable of learning something, not forgetting? Are we capable of getting out of our immediate interest, our selective memories, and actually learn something of new things, especially when we are dealing with problems, as our panelists will go over, which are very slow. Some of those problems they will talk about, like sustainability issues and habit changes, are so slow that a lot of people are, we struggle a little bit with capturing them. They're just too small for our short attention span we have sometimes. So today we have three panelists that will tell us a little bit about the different aspects of the sustainability issue, the planning issues and changes that have been going on. It will touch on also lack of policies and all kinds of discussion that we have had during this year. The first person that will actually talk is Kate Rantald, who leads the sustainability partners for Google Real Estate and Workplace Services. She has been working quite a lot in trying to understand how growth strategies in big companies can actually scale, but at the same time be in harmony with nature, which is not always easy. She will tell us about some discussion and projects she has been working on in the Bay Area. And after that, we will have Kelly Main, who actually did the MIT Design X course in 2020. She has been working on things that go from quite digital, machine learning, so strategic or smart cities, over to community building and more soft issues like a culture. And she will tell us about her experience and her startup that she has been working on. And then last we have Paola Melanotti Rizzoli, who is a physical oceanographer. And she has been working on and studying climate effect on the ocean, these tiny little changes that are impacting us much more than we actually like to believe and remember. And she will tell us a little bit about her hometown, Venice, which has actually quite big problem with flooding, which have been an area of her studies. And also some other experiences that she has been working on regarding modeling of extreme complicated things like climate models and things I'm a little bit lost on. I'm just a simple designer. So if I just give over the word to Kate.
Excellent. Thank you, Siggy. And Kelly and Paolo, it's great to be on this panel with you guys. Thank you so much for hosting. And I've been listening to the talks today, and they've been really fascinating and very thought-provoking. So it's an honor to be here. So thank you for the introduction, Siggy. That was perfect segue and tee up. So yeah, I work in the real estate department at Google, and quite honestly, it's a world within a world. I often say I don't know what I'm doing at a technology company, because that's not my world. My world has always been real estate, design, and construction. So it's a little bit of my background. And the team that I lead is responsible for all of our sustainability initiatives and programs across our global portfolio. So it's a huge scale, highly complex, lots of players, lots of growth. And one of my focus areas over the years that I've been at Google, which has been about a little over 6 years, has been about climate change and climate resilience, and thinking about that risk set over time. And I really started this effort, this initiative a few years ago with a very, very simple question, which was, can we just get a signal in the noise on how emerging climate factors like sea level rise and flooding and temperature increase are going to impact our business operations, but more importantly, the communities that we operate in. And so at the time that I started this effort, which was almost 6 years ago, the Obama administration had just signed on to the Paris Climate Accord. It was a very different time, quite frankly. Like, I think there was a attitude, a position that a lot of similar companies or developers, if you will, sort of had this a position that governments, agencies, policy are going to fill in a lot of the solutions or strategies for dealing with climate change. And the Paris Climate Accord was a big deal at that time. Yeah, it's been an interesting 6 years because just the shifts in policy, but also in those 6 years, 5-6 years, I've also seen just like this massive amount of growth at Google. And it's really quite humbling, I have to say, just how challenging the sort of scale and complexity is of the problems that we're trying to address. And part of what makes it so challenging is optimizing solutions at the right scale. So when we think about climate change, we think about climate resilience, really think about it like an outcome. It's not necessarily, there's not a silver bullet, there's not a one size fits all solution. And I think from that standpoint, what we're really after when we sort of talk about resilience, is this really we're really looking at addressing it, optimizing sort of our addressing that challenge at the regional scale. So not just a building scale or campus scale, but at the regional scale. So if there's one sort of like conclusion I've come to, or a couple of conclusions I've come to as a result of all this work, it's that private sector companies, particularly ones that are large portfolio owners or operators, really have an important role to play in building adaptive capacity in our communities, but that we really can't do it alone. So to illustrate that, I'm going to share a few slides. There we go. So yeah, let's go over here. There we go. So our Google's headquarters in the Bay Area is located in the southern end of the Bay. So if you're not familiar with the Bay Area, San Francisco, where the small blue square on the right there, SF, San Francisco, that's a peninsula, and then Google's headquarters are down sort of at the bottom of the bay, Sunnyvale and Mountain View. And it's a very ecologically sensitive area. And as a result, there's a number of different sort of climate risks that we have, more so than other regions. It just being so close to the water, and also being at risk for what's called fluvial flooding, some of the flooding that comes from precipitation. So also not uncommon for a lot of urban centers that have grown really rapidly over the last decade or so. We have sort of a common challenge, which is that traditional infrastructure planning processes are really not equipped to address complexities of the shoreline. It is right now the shoreline where we exist is this sort of puzzle of public and private ownership. And there's a lot of efforts underway, but they're all quite siloed from each other. So it is a very complex, what we call hydrological legacy. Go to the next slide. But we also sort of really understand that the cost of an action is quite high. And again, this is not just, you know, when Google thinks about it, we're not just thinking about it from just our portfolio, real estate portfolio standpoint, but really the communities that are at risk. and I can't stress the point enough of like just how complex it is from a housing and transportation standpoint, and also the ecological environmental risk standpoint. But we also know that right now is a really important time to invest because there are so many planning efforts underway, both on the public side and on the private side. A lot of developers have come into this area and have been building up, particularly, well, both residential and commercial. So what we really came to was this need to form a new kind of collaboration across public and private sector. So this gets at my point earlier, is like Google's not going to be able to do this alone. And if we're going to be optimizing at the regional scale, we really need to envision a different way to do this. It's not just about our investments or expecting, you know, the federal government to come in and build a better levee. We brought together a set of public and private organizations in the area, including, you know, local governments and utilities, water utility, to really re-envision a different shoreline, a different way to address sort of the climate risks, but that kind of brought together not the usual suspects into the room to come up with a common vision and a common time horizon. So our vision, actually, together with these other agencies and organizations, is really leaning on the ideas of, you know, really creating a healthy place where businesses and local communities can thrive is one of our most important missions in all of this. And then another really important critical aspect of it is the investment in nature-based solutions. So what we kind of call, you know, sort of characterize nature as an important part of the infrastructure in this ecologically sensitive area. And so we're investing in nature-based solutions. We're looking at large-scale restoration of habitat that has that not just makes the place more beautiful, but also has added capacity to address things like storm protection. And then really demonstrate that economic development and climate resilience can go hand in hand. So again, we sort of see this as a real important demonstration of the innovation that can come from something simple, like coming together with not the usual suspects to partner on long-term vision. So with that, I will hand it to the next speaker.
Yeah, perfect timing, Kate. So Kelly, if you would tell us a little bit about your interest and work you have been doing.
Sure, thank you. So I'll go ahead and try to get this set up correctly. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Kelly Leilani Main. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Buy-In Community Planning. And I'm really honored to be sharing more about our organization, Buy-In, on behalf of my team and our partners. All right, so 2020 was a really overwhelming year. The pandemic certainly brought life to a halt, even as demands for social justice brought millions to the street. But 2020 was also the most active hurricane season on record, and that was for the 6th year in a row. And so the point here is that climate change is already here. It's already happening. It's affecting communities now. And increasingly detailed projections are highlighting the gross underestimation of risk. For many, the pandemic highlighted a major question, which is, what should we do if home is no longer safe? As many as 41 million Americans, or about $1 trillion of real estate, are at risk in the next century. However, very limited institutional infrastructure currently exists to connect families to relocation assistance that can help them permanently move out of harm's way and into safer locations. Instead, we have a disaster response and hazard mitigation industry that primarily pushes for the construction and maintenance of carbon-intensive band-aids like seawalls and levees, which only defer the problem, and they also suffocate local ecosystems. So one way that the government does help households move to higher ground is through voluntary property acquisitions, which are also known as home buyouts. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has implemented over 40,000 buyouts in nearly every state in the country since the 1980s. Other federal agencies such as HUD, the USDA, and the US Army Corps of Engineers are also able to implement programs, but they don't have much of a role to play, as FEMA. And in theory, a buyout should be simple. The homeowner tells the government they want to move, and the government pays them, which enables them to move. But in reality, the bureaucracy is extremely complicated. And as a result, communities with resources and dedicated staff are the most likely to secure funding from government agencies, exacerbating the disproportionate impacts of disasters on poor communities and communities of color. And as a result, buyouts have deeply inequitable outcomes. Not only do buyouts predominantly serve white communities, but they primarily target low-income residents in those communities, speaking to the depressed values and higher vulnerabilities often seen in communities of color. This is compounded by the legacies of racial, environmental, and social injustices, including forced displacement, redlining, and segregation, which have threatened the survival of Black and Indigenous communities since the country's inception. It has also resulted in tremendous distrust of government-led processes, of course, for good reason. Buyouts also don't necessarily reduce vulnerability, since people generally relocate close by and where they can afford, which is sometimes even in the same neighborhood. Very few programs actually monitor or track buyout outcomes, so it's also very difficult to build a culture of accountability. And it's critical to highlight that behind all of this bureaucracy are people. Individual decisions to migrate or relocate are complicated, driven by a combination of interlocking push and pull factors, agency, and economic and spatial mobility. So how do we address these intersectional elements and make the process more equitable and empowering? Well, as an organization, we've realized that buyouts are an important but oversimplified solution to a system of interlocking crises in the US, including economic inequality, scarce and unaffordable housing, and ever worsening flood risks. And that's partially because a buyout process simplifies the wrong elements. It reduces complex understandings of self, place, home, and history into a hazard to be managed and a real estate transaction to be conducted. So to have a more just approach to climate relocation, we have to better understand human and community needs, which we've started to articulate as people, housing, and land. These are guided by three key questions: who wants to move, where will they go, and what happens to the land that gets left behind? From these three questions, we can articulate the interlocking systems that enable transformative action across each of these three scales and find meaningful partnerships at the center of collective goals to build solutions that are mutually beneficial rather than antagonistic. So how does this actually work for our organization? Well, we've been developing a web mapping application using Esri-enabled geospatial software that makes program intake, demand, and supplementary needs more visible. It also helps us identify clusters of parcels to maximize reuse potential for innovative partnerships with conservation groups, land trusts, and wetland restoration agencies. At a national scale, we believe this vision can not only direct more resources to the communities most at risk, but help visibilize demand for relocation assistance and mainstream migration as a legitimate adaptation strategy. I want to share a little bit more about how this is playing out on the ground for us. In one of our pilot communities in DeSoto, Missouri, we received about 36 responses to a survey we distributed online via Facebook. There's about 250 parcels located in the floodway, which is the highest risk area of this community. So to reach more than 80 other people, our community partners insisted we experiment with using a regular paper mailing So we translated our coded form from the internet back into a Word document, and our community partners handwrote 80 addresses and stamped them, and they're going out in the mail this week. So there's a concept called universal design, which we've been realizing, which is that by considering the diverse needs and abilities of all throughout the design process, universal design creates products, services, and environments that meet people's needs. So as designers, our role has been not just to streamline the application process, but also to ask the right questions, to work with community members, and to make sure that everyone who is at risk knows that there is assistance available if they want it. On the back end, we're creating a data architecture that matches this survey intake form, which is really human-centered, with private and publicly available data sets, funding eligibility determinations, and other data sources to help program managers and our staff allocate resources to interested homeowners. And we're also building a customer relationship management or communication system that makes the process more user-friendly for homeowners. It sends them reminders and updates on the status of their application, funding streams, and how long they have to wait, and contacts them in the method that is preferred for them, which sometimes is by word of mouth. So just to summarize a couple of key takeaways I look forward to having a conversation with the panelists with. Like the pandemic, climate change will affect all of us, but it's not going to affect all of us equally. Communities of color and poor communities are the most negatively impacted and the most likely to experience worse outcomes. So directing targeted services and methods to ways to reach them on the ground is really important for our organization. Secondly, technology is what drives our company, but it's not what drives the communities that we work in. So we have to find a way to bridge the analog-digital divide for decision-making by translating our tools into usable services for our partners and doing the work to make those systems integrate. And lastly, solving complex problems means convening stakeholders across all sectors, backgrounds, and interests. We really can't get all of the resources that we need by working alone, and we're really excited to continue expanding our partnerships in this area. So I know that's a lot of information. I really thank you for learning more about buy-in, and here's some contact information, but I look forward to continuing the conversation with the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Kelly. A lot of information and packed in. You're really very dense. So, Paula, I think it's the moment to tell us a bit more about, because you've been working on climate changes and climate for years. Paula, you have to unmute.
Myself, yes, I have a mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have, okay. Thank you, Joel, beautiful. But before, this is the first slide, but before I wanted to introduce myself. I am a physical oceanographer, but I am also climate science, because climate is such a big umbrella that each Earth scientist had to become a climate science, because climate encompasses all the science of the Earth. The theme we have is the next pandemic is now. And to me, I take it that in a sense, our next pandemic is climate. Climate change is undoubtedly the greatest challenge we face in our century. And it has been going on, and what lessons have we learned? Well, at the end, I want to finish with the slide, which shows that maybe Venice has learned the lesson from this pandemic. But now from climate, the climate has been known in the scientific environment for decades. Is climate, the long-term climate effects, are they on the horizon of the general population? Well, what is the major difference between climate and the present pandemic is the time scale. The pandemic has a time scale of a few months to 2 years. In 3 months, we were all aware of the enormous threat we have to our health, and the consequences has been worse than we had predicted. But the pandemic scale, like the Spanish flu, are the order of 3-4 years, and they affect us immediately. Climate, on the other side, by definition, is the science of long time scales. What Kelly showed, and I thank her because that's my first example, and I have the hurricanes in the Atlantic. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the time scales of climate are long. climate science studies the long time trends in the evolution of properties of the Earth. You know all the IPCC reports. In all the IPCC reports, the scenarios for projection in the future extend at least to 2100. The last IPCC report of 2019 has a scenario. The most terrifying is business as usual, you know, that is nothing is done to mitigate the anthropogenic effects which induce climate, has the projection of the average mean sea level, global mean sea level projection until 2300. And that report was a special report on the ocean and ice released in 2019. But there are most of these longer term effects are beyond the horizon of the people who do not work in climate. Because they are so much in the future, you know, the sea level is rising, but the average global mean sea level is not rising at the rate for which, let us run to take protection. However, there are some climate effects which are short in time, and those are which affect us now, and those have the time scales which you can compare to the present pandemic because they affect us now. That is what we call extreme events. The Atlantic hurricanes which Kelly showed are extreme events. This slide, I think it is a very intuitive and pictorial way of showing how the increase in mean global average temperature all over the globe increases the extreme events. Look at the first curve. It is in jargon normal distribution. In the previous climate, the average is centered at the central point. You have the extreme event of less cold weather, the extreme event, the high weather. But the global average temperature is increasing, and in some parts of the Earth it is increasing. It has increased in the last decade of 3 centigrades, which is enormous. What happens to the probability distribution? It shifts to the right, and shift to the right, you see that you have more hot weather, but you have more record hot weather. The extreme events are the tails of the probability curve. And these tails are the extreme events which have dramatically increased during these last 2 decades. And I want to give you some examples because those are what are affecting us on the time scale of the pandemic. I will come back. The first extreme event I want to talk about are the heat waves in Europe. You remember in 2003, there was a heat wave for which Paris and London reached 40 centigrades. A lot of old elderly people died because at those latitudes, most houses still did not have air conditioning. Well, I tell you, in this last decade, Europe, and not only the Mediterranean countries, but going up to Germany, France, and so forth, has had a heat wave basically every summer. Every summer there is, in June, in July, there is a terrifying heat waves, which is torrid weather. The second and even more startling examples for the United States is the hurricanes. Kelly has showed the hurricanes. The hurricanes have increased in number and strength dramatically in this last decade. The hurricanes are tropical hurricanes, which are formed in the tropical Atlantic. And I want to give, and you see, you are watching the tail, the little tail of the probability curve, which is what the climate affects, which affects us now and not in 2100. What are they? Why are these hurricanes so dramatic in their effects? Well, their trajectory goes up parallel to the eastern coast of the United States. They travel over water. Now, the quantity, the oceanic quantity, which has increased the most in these last 20 years is the ocean heat content in the upper 700 meters. What is the ocean heat content? Is the engine of the hurricanes. The hurricanes absorb heat from the ocean. The ocean has warmed up the upper 600 meters. The ocean heat is energy. The hurricanes become bigger, stronger, and you saw the last one effect, I don't remember the name, almost destroyed New Orleans. Kelly was talking about the effects on the coast of Florida and so forth. Those are the storm surges induced by the hurricanes, which are terrifying and they have an enormous effect, and it is now. So these are effects which must be taken into account in this moment, and these are the extreme effects due to global warming. I hope this curve to me is a very intuitive example about how global warming has increased the frequency of hurricanes. I want to go to Europe because there we have the same type of problems, and there are two seas, the North Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which suffers from storm surges. In the North Sea, there are cyclogenesis, that is cyclones. Cyclones are small-scale equivalent of tropical Atlantic hurricanes. In 1953, in the North Sea, there was a tremendous storm surge induced by one of these cyclones. The entire Netherlands were flooded and 3,000 people died. So just at that time, the Netherlands started their project of defending their country. Netherlands are under the mean sea level, but they built a system of protections, let us say all the Moses of the Netherlands. This system is the Delta work, which has been defined the 7th wonder of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers. London has a Moses because the storm surges of the North Sea go up the River Thames and flood London. These are all short-term, these are all extreme effects which are induced by global change. The Mediterranean is even more extreme than the North Sea. In the Mediterranean, there are two types of cyclones, one which is sort of, and they're all responsible for the floods of Venice. The small cyclone, you have the jet stream. The jet stream is the mid-latitude winds, which at the mid-latitude flow from North America towards Europe. When they encounter the Alps, the mountain Alps, for a phenomenon which in jargon is called Baroclinic Stability, but it is simple to explain. The orography exercises a torque on the jet stream. The torque bends the isobars and the isobar form a cyclone. This phenomenon is called cyclogenesis in the lee of the Alps. And the cyclone goes on to the Adriatic Sea and induces a storm surge of the Adriatic Sea, blowing the wind from the southern Adriatic to the northern Adriatic. Under the wind, the sea level abruptly and very quickly rises. What is at the end of the northern Adriatic Sea? Venice. That is the storm surge of the Adriatic Sea, which floods Venice. But recently, in the Mediterranean Sea, another phenomenon has become more and more frequent because the Mediterranean Sea is much hotter than it was 20 years ago. And this phenomenon, which I don't think you ever heard, only the people involved in the works know the name, are the megacanes. The megacanes are Mediterranean hurricanes. They are totally the equivalent of the Atlantic hurricanes. They develop over the sea. And basically they develop over the Ionian Sea, and especially they are frequent in the months of October, November, December, because those are the months of the summer of the Mediterranean Sea. The ocean has a much longer memory than the atmosphere. The ocean keeps heat for a much longer term. And the Mediterranean Sea, like the Atlantic Ocean, has warmed tremendously under the effect of global warming. So the megacanes is a giant hurricane, a giant cyclone, which develops over the Ionian Sea, eats the heat from the sea, and blows the wind so strongly that the storm surge induced by these megacanes are 1 order of magnitude bigger than those induced by the regular cyclones. This was what happened in November 2012. I have the meteorological maps, and you can see this giant hurricane, Mediterranean hurricane, over the entire sea, and the destruction of Venice was enormous. For those who remember, Venice was destroyed, it was underwater for a week. Also, the event of 1966, that extreme event, which was the record height of 2 meters, 2 meters, Venice was under 2 meters of water, only for 1 day and a half, however. The event in November 2012 lasted 1 week. I have a movie in which you see this giant cyclone covering the entire peninsula, covering Venice and Florence simultaneously, and that's what caused also the destruction of Florence. Now, the normal cyclones always existed. Venice is used to flood. I remember I was in high school when there was one event in November, and we were all happy because we could not go to school because the city was flooded. However, the global warming has increased the number of extreme events. The megacanes, which were almost unknown, 1 or 2, the one in 1966 now, have become more frequent. In 2008, there was another one. Last November, this giant megacane. All these effects are short-time effects. And they must be taken into account because even though the growth of the global mean sea level rise is something which occurs slowly and will affect us in 2100 at the earliest, and depending on the prediction, the scenarios, if climate mitigation measures are adopted or not, but these effects are now. These effects must be taken into account in every planning of a city, in every planning which we do for our city, as Kelly was saying. Have we learned a climate lesson from these effects? I am afraid that our memory is very short. If I think about the climate problem was known, I'll tell you, the first presentation at the American Congress was in 1987, when Jim Hansen, the director of Goddard GIS in New York, showed the data of the increase of greenhouse gases from Mauna Loa and the data of the increase in the surface temperature, in the global mean temperature. I must say that unfortunately, the European countries have been much more sensitive to the spectrum of climate change. And only under this last presidency, finally, the US have joined the game, the consortium of Europeans to try to mitigate the climate effects. Have we learned? I want to show you another slide, only 2 slides. Let me go down, no, the previous one. Can we all go up the next two? That's okay. Let us go to the last one. Let us go to the last one. It is the last. Can we go to the last slide? It was so nice. It was Venice. Thank you. Joel,
so,
you are my...
Paula, do you hear me, Paula?
Yes, I can conclude in words.
Yeah, no, we are running a little bit over time, so...
Well, I'll finish now. You asked us, have we learned something from this pandemic? Well, this is a picture which shows that Venice has become a green city. Below, you have the Venice picture from satellite of 19th of April, and you cannot see anything because all the lagoon, the water is full of the sediments emitted in the water by the ships, not only the big ships, but all the ships of the city. Look today, 13th of April 2020, you see the bottom. Venice is clean. The pandemic has cleaned Venice. And I hope that the Venice city has learned a little lesson from this to try to mitigate and to avoid the mobs which in hundreds of millions of citizens invade Venice, and maybe there will be a more reasonable planning for the future of Venice, of over-tourism, eliminating the green ships. So who knows, maybe in a local example, a little lesson has been gained just only from this pandemic. I have finished. You can close yeah.
Okay, great, Paula, thanks. It's quite fascinating to see how Venice have actually cleaned up, and I think we all kind of remember when we saw those images of the dolphins and all kinds of things. What is kind of would like to maybe ask Kate first, because it looks like you mentioned, and Kelly mentioned it, I mean, complex problems, and what you're all dealing with are pretty complex problems. And I'm kind of curious about, because one of the tricky things with understanding and solving complex problems is actually to understand the context. And understanding the context is aligning, you know, all the stakeholders. So maybe Kate, you can tell us something about what you have learned in your experience in the Bay Area. I think that was a pretty tricky. I mean, you had stakeholders going from rats to cats, apart from rats.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's interesting. I just gave a talk on this yesterday about the importance of context, because you need to know context in order to understand a root cause. And I'm speaking in generalities here, and I will get specific, but I believe understanding context is critical to understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And aligning on, especially with complex problems like climate risk, and the effort that I showed earlier of bringing together these different stakeholder groups, we needed to really understand the context within that each of those stakeholder groups were operating in order to just align on what the problem was that we were solving, so that we could get together with a vision, and it didn't become, oh, this is Google's vision, or oh, this is the city's vision, or oh, this is someone else's vision. There was no dominating of that agenda. So the context is really important. And it's funny, you mentioned the thing about the cats and the rats. This is an anecdote I was telling Siggy about the other day, just in terms of, you know, once you start to, you know, try to solve one little problem over here without understanding context, you can very quickly tug on other problems, particularly when it comes to, you know, particularly when it comes to ecological systems. So as I was saying earlier, a lot of our sort of approach, particularly in the Bay Area, given how ecologically sensitive the area is we're really trying to create a create a opportunity for the local ecology to thrive, to come back the way that it was, you know, decades ago before all of this development, because that's really where it performs optimally. That's where we can sort of like optimize the best possible, you know, benefit of those ecosystems. But that's been an important piece of the context for Google and for other sort of players in this arena, is that you know, when it comes to context, it's not just, okay, we want the business to do well, or we want the people to be able to get to work, or we want to give them a house. It's also, there's a whole ecosystem here that is an important part of the whole context. So, yeah.
So you're with us at the context. I mean, it sounds simple, but I know that often it can be very, very complicated to understand the context thoroughly, because you may underestimate all the consequences of little acts. And I guess, yes, Kelly, you have probably had some interesting experiences with working with the communities, and you know that's similar maybe to the issues that Kate. You have the policy on one hand, you have you know, government or federal agencies, and then you have just people.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to the conversation around context as well, that it's really important that we ground the work that we're doing in the legacies of injustice and discrimination for the most affected communities that don't currently have the resources to really adapt to climate change in a really holistic and meaningful way. I think that one of the things that I'd like to add in response to that question that also speaks to Paula's presentation as well, is the issue of timescale is really important. Most buyouts have happened after a disaster occurs. And if you're trying to protect people and trying to protect assets, doing things reactively rather than proactively is not a very good strategy for keeping people safe and minimizing your economic and social and ecological losses. So one of the things that we're trying to build are flexible timescales and a kind of open enrollment process to sign up for relocation assistance. And part of that is to save money. It's for every $7 spent on a buyout, or every dollar spent on a buyout. Today, we save $7 in future losses, whether that be through hazard mitigation or through insurance claims through the National Flood Insurance Program. But what it does is it also gives people the time to really sit and think and consider what their needs are and what their options and opportunities are. And we're trying to bridge the sort of extreme weather shock events and what Paul is describing as the now events, which are happening more and more frequently, with people's longer term visions about the future. You know, things like a 30-year mortgage, or when I retire, or when my kids are going to graduate from college. That sometimes it's not about wanting a buyout today, but it's about, well, I'd like relocation assistance, but it needs to make sense within the time frame of my life. And people could decide that it's time for them to go at any point. And right now there's no mechanism for them really getting that sort of flexible case management and support for making that kind of decision when it makes most sense for them and their community.
No, I totally with you on this. In fact, that was one of the things when Paula was talking earlier when I was kind of preparing for this, is the time scale issue, because it seems everything that is with a big time scale, or so tiny little changes, but they will just go on. There's nothing almost that can stop it. It seems that as humans are not very good in it. I would be curious, Paula, because you mentioned Moses's, and people have been, solving. It's a little bit like putting a catalyst instead of going to an electric car. No, it's like fixing it with that technology. How was it in Venice? Because I live in Italy, and it's not always easy to get the Italians along. How was that? The whole stakeholder setup and getting people aligned in Venice regarding the Moses?
Horrible, horrible. The Mose, unfortunately, has a very disgraceful history because of political corruption. You live in Italy and you know that political corruption is endemic in Italy. The Mose was a wonderful project and is, I would call the Mose the seventh wonders of the world. But it took 23 years. And the public opinion was always divided because the public opinion that is driven by emotionality and is driven by everything is no or everything is yes, and it is a lot of the political parties. It is an assumption of what you believe or what you don't believe. So the public opinion was always controversial. The scandal of the Mose, the corruption, the political corruption of 2014 had a disastrous effect because it stopped all 5 years. But again, people, and I'll give you the example of Venice. Because of this, the works of the Mose were delayed. And so, oh, no Mose, and it will never work. I was a consultant from the Mose from 1995 to 2013, and it works magnificently. But obviously it was no Mose. For 5 years, all the works were stopped. It was finally completed in beginning 2020. So when it was raised, and finally in September, October of 2020, there was a high water for 1 week and Venice was dry, I think all over the newspapers of the world came, Venice is dry. Then all the people of the no Mose became yes Mose. So now there is the point that the Mose costs a lot. To raise the entire 4 barriers for 1 day costs, I think, about 300,000 euros. The more the raising up, the more it costs. Now, if you don't raise the Mose when there's predicted high water, everybody screams, why don't you? So unfortunately, the memory of human beings is slow. And that's why, a problem like climate, the events Kelly defined now, the extreme events are felt now. Why was the Mose completed? Because the event of November 2012, when Venice, you have seen all the images, was underwater, San Marco Square for an entire week, that was, the memory was that was a wake-up call.
So
But
Paolo, you are saying basically that we humans, we need a disaster to learn, and
exactly. We learn only when there is a disaster. When hurricane whatever destroyed the New Orleans, and then they made the wall in New Orleans. When the Netherlands were flooded and 3,000 people died, unfortunately, we are incapable, or I don't know, maybe it is my peculiar experience in Venice. We should plan for the long term. Plan for the long, that's what Kelly was saying. If I need an insurance, I must have an insurance for my lifetime and not for tomorrow because I have a stroke and I fall down.
Yeah.
So
then we have Paolo, we have a very short because they are telling me we're running out of time. So I wanted just to get another question in to maybe if we go another round with Kate and then we take Kelly. Regarding so we said complex, I mean, and we have been talking about context and we have been talking about stakeholders, but the whole thing about this slowness and the thing about people and relating to that, because, okay, when people saw Moses rising, okay, people believed, and this is to be a covering through the history, no?
Yes.
But the question here is, in your experiences, Kate, for example, what has worked best to align people, to envision them all together? Because this is another tricky thing. Stakeholder analysis is one thing, but aligning people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, beyond what I sort of talked about before in terms of understanding context in order to agree on the problem we're solving, and getting to a common vision. I think it is also, I think one of the most important, like, sort of positions we've taken that's really helped to engage with the communities is to be you know, transparent about intentions, and to really like emphasize and reinforce that the intent, the value set, behind our you know, vision and our developments in the Bay Area and other places as Google continues to grow is about creating places for people to thrive. But it is, I mean, just to reemphasize, like it's hard because so much is changing, and there's you know, there's you know, whatever it was that you know got us here is not what will take, you know, get us to the next, you know, next frontier. So but I think, yeah, the transparency of intention and the commitment to communities and to people, and putting people at the center of those decisions instead of, you know, just the business or just growth. Yeah. So I'll pass it to Kelly.
Yeah, because that seems similar to what you were mentioning, Kelly, about human-centered design. So your approach is very much putting the people at the center.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we certainly are encountering in some of the communities we're working is there's a lot of misconceptions of the intention of buyout programs. There's an idea that the government is going to come and they're going to lowball you an offer and they're going to take your property and they're going to redevelop it, and nothing is being done that really speaks to what people need. So I think that there's also a misconception that people don't want help relocating. They don't want buyouts. But the truth is that buyouts as they exist today aren't actually helping people relocate in a way that makes sense for them as humans, in a way that centers having safe and affordable housing, in a way that centers having access to jobs and economic security, in a way that makes sure that their kids have somewhere that they can go to school, and that they have neighborhoods and communities that they can rely on and that they trust. So if a buyout program doesn't speak to those four things, at a minimum, it's very unlikely that people will be willing or interested in participating. And we think starting those conversations early and building those into more comprehensive relocation assistance programs is one of the only ways that we can really address the scale of vulnerability across the US landscape when it comes to climate change impacts.
Okay. No, I'm totally with you on that, and it's all about actually, it's actually quite simple, because we often believe technology is driving everything, and maybe even too much, but technology is an enabler. It should be about us, that we and where we live, which happens to be the planet we have. Well, we have very few minutes left, but I would really like to, I know it's not going to be a long time to give any conclusion, but if you can just briefly, each and one, maybe you start with Paula. You have to be short now.
Yeah.
You start with you, but just a little bit, are humans able to learn from some lessons? And what is your thinking on, you know, are we going to be able to learn from this COVID, or is it just going to be one thing that passes like anything else? Short.
I don't know. I hope so, because you see, did we learn from the Spanish flu? I don't know. I know only that it remained in the memory, because in Italy, all the people of that age which were remembering the Spanish flu with the terror, and the masks were cold. I have seen old pictures. I hope so, simply because today we are not isolated. Today there is a globalization. Our communications are all over the world. So what happens in Italy, what happens in China, what happens in India, what happens in the United States, this pandemic has been affected everybody, but it's known by everybody. The information is there. This is, I think, the new variable with respect of past pandemia, because past pandemia were known only in the country in which they were. Now we have a new variable in everything. Now that means, we are talking away, you are in Milan. So I have a tendency to be positive and optimistic. I really hope that because of the new tools, we can communicate all over, we know more. We are aware more of what happens in our neighboring country. We know more about our fellow human beings, be they good, be they bad, be they poor, be they rich. I hope this new dimension really will help us to learn something from this pandemic and provide for the giant pandemic, which is a global change.
Okay, so Kate, you're very short.
I'll be very short. I do think we're capable of learning, but I think it is a matter of embracing change and seeing opportunity and embracing that opportunity.
Kelly?
Yeah, I think in the context of the work that we're doing, it's been very inspiring to see more wide social acceptance of the demands for racial justice and social and economic justice in this country. The pandemic really highlighted those. And so what I certainly am aspirational or encouraged by for our organization is that we'll take the opportunity from learning from the horrors of the pandemic and things like police brutality and violence to really transforming systems like housing, and the way that we manage and steward land and build our cities. That'll be really transformational across society. So I think the interconnections are what's really powerful, and we've certainly learned from those.
Great. No, I think, I mean, you're touching on it. It is about people, and people we have our faults and flaws, but we tend to, believe in values. We tend to have optimistic, and I think you all have kind of said that we believe things can change and we learn, and probably is never stop doing and never stop trying. So I will really like to thank you a lot for your intervention tonight and for the good discussion.